So, welcome back to the room. Hope you're feeling refreshed after lunch. Who knew sitting down was so exhausting? Science. It's blown my mind. I'm going to bring it down to a much more human level, I think. As mentioned earlier, my name's Sam. I'm a filmmaker. And growing up with Allport, I was quite a rebellious child. I did all the sports. So that led to sort of being my escape from the condition. I found it was a good distraction for me. And with that, I suppose, came a slight lack of acceptance of it. I just wanted to ignore it and go and do stupid stuff all the time. But I got to the point where it was kind of taking a hold in 2018. I was suffering with loneliness, anxiety, and depression with it. And I contacted Susie. And basically, that's completely changed my perspective of everything since being involved in the community. And I decided to quit my job and go and try and cycle 6,000 miles around Europe to raise money for Allport UK. And while doing that, I took my camera and decided I was going to make a documentary about it to try and raise as much awareness of the condition as possible, but also to connect with others that were going through the same sort of challenges I was. And the adventure led me to finding a much greater level of acceptance of the condition, and I hope to share that with everyone who's willing to watch it. So this is the trailer that I've put together from the footage I collected. Let's go. My doctor explained to me that I had a time bomb inside of me when I was 10 years old. I always expect the worst. Alport syndrome causes hearing loss, eye abnormalities, and kidney failure.
We can see that your kidney function is deteriorating quite fast.
It looks as though I'll be on dialysis within 12 months. I've always wanted to do something for charity, but never knew what.
I'm going to cycle 10,000 kilometres around Europe and jump out of a plane in every country I visit.
Oh, man! Accepting something is the hardest thing to do.
I could smash this. I'm not going to lie and say that I'm not scared either.
This trip is very likely to accelerate the decline in your kidney function.
I just don't know if I can actually carry on. What am I doing? I feel like I've been punched in the face.
So you're having leg swelling because your kidney function is down?
This is something completely beyond my control. It causes a lot of anxiety.
It's alright doing whatever takes your mind off it, but the fact is it's always there.
Looks like there's a storm creeping in behind me.
All I want to do is escape it. All the time, I just want to escape it.
When you start learning about how to change your mindset and stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start to think, well, what can I learn from it? But it's making that decision to focus on the positives instead. And just what if this is no longer a journey into kidney failure, but a journey into self-healing?
Welcome to my roller coaster. I don't want to have sex with men. My left hearing aid has just broken. This is absolute hell to ride on. I've just got to keep going, and I will never give up.
Lisa, do you understand?
Thank you, Sam. We're very, very lucky to have you to explain what it's like to live with Alport syndrome. And I know it's been a really tricky journey, but you're a real inspiration to a lot of us, and it's absolutely fabulous. The filming, isn't that amazing? What a creative young man, hey? So, I mean, I'm just dying for this film. And if anybody has any contacts in the film industry, I'm sure Sam would love to hear about them. But that's the next stage of the journey, to actually find a distributor, isn't it, for the film, which is a really important part of this. But the role that the young people play in explaining the experience is vital, and Sam is really good at explaining the mental health aspects. I spoke about that earlier this morning, but I think it's something not to be underestimated, and it changes over time. There are just so many different stages in our journeys, and sometimes they're unexpected stages that there's a lot to deal with. So thank you, Sam, very much. Okay, we're moving on. In terms of our next session, we're going to be, unfortunately, one of our speakers, Alicia, is not very well. And we very kindly got Rachel Lennon, who's part of the project involved in the naming of Allport Syndrome, which is a really important project for us as the Alport Syndrome Alliance, because it has a couple of really important things. One is, as we understand more about Allports, are we calling it the right thing? Does it help patients? Does it help clinicians, etc. too? But I'd like Rachel to talk about the actual project. So Rachel, are you online?
Hi, can you hear me, Susie?
Yes, can hear you beautifully.
Yeah.
Over to you to update us on the naming project.
Excellent. Yeah, first of all, such a fantastic trailer there, Sam. Really wonderful to see it. So just very briefly, the project that a few of us have been working on with Alicia on naming, as Susie said, one of the reasons to launch into this was it was based on how we're learning more. There's more and more information that we learn about conditions such as Alport syndrome. So across the spectrum of medical conditions, where we have traditionally started out by naming a condition by the person who first described it, so named after an individual, we're now getting lots more information about the features of a features of a condition, and that relates to the pathology, the genetics, and so on. And so that raises the question whether we need to consider naming not just for Alport syndrome, but other medical conditions more broadly. So do we need to change the name of medical conditions to keep up to date with the additional features that we're learning about? Should there be a convention for naming across medical conditions so that it's perhaps easier to follow for all sorts of people, all sorts of audiences? And who should we consult in order to help find these answers for different conditions? Over the last few months and probably years actually within this community, there's been debate about the naming of Alport syndrome, and that's been fueled for sure with the genetic studies, and in considering different options for naming Alport syndrome. We've had recent discussions within a variety of workshops that Alicia has hosted. And some of the interesting feedback that's come about some of the wording from those discussions, I'll just give three examples. One is the word syndrome. Is that appropriate for Alport? I guess its strict definition is a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular abnormality or condition. Thinking about the spectrum, the wider spectrum that we see now with Alport syndrome, not all of the time do we see all of the features. So in some individuals, there'll perhaps just be the hematuria as a feature that is seen with having a single abnormal copy of one of the Alport genes. So that's raised concerns about the word syndrome. There's other names that have come up and are in the literature for sure, such as basement membrane nephropathy. And there's concerns about terms like that and collagenopathy as not being so accessible for broader audiences. What did certainly come out from a lot of those discussions was that the word Allport was really important and really important for patient organisations across the world. So we've been considering alternative strategies to naming, and that's really where this project will move forward. So that was just a really brief introduction in place of Alicia, who does a much better job than me, that hopefully sets the scene for more to come on this. And whilst we've had some online workshops, we're hoping to follow that up by a written survey that people can think about and take their time to express their views and opinions on this, on the naming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for giving us. I just wondered if there were any questions. Obviously, we haven't gone into much detail, but does anybody have any comments or questions on naming?
If I may, do you hear me?
Yes, Rosa, hi, go ahead.
Thanks, Rachel, for this excellent introduction. Well, I think the same than for Alport happens in other diseases, that as I shown in my slides, what Dr. Alport described is just a small percentage of what we see now in patients having mutations in these genes, but the same happens in other diseases. So for other diseases, it's being used kind of description plus the gene. So this is an option. There are many options, as Rachel said, but concerns for all of them. Now, what is sure, and it's really needed, is to reach a consensus with patients and treating physicians from all over the world. Otherwise, we won't get there. I mean, we cannot come up with a new name, invented one that is not well accepted. So it needs to be something really accepted and agreed on all the Alport community. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Rosa, thank you. Very, very well said. One of the things that Alicia has been doing as part of her ClinGen work is a whole series of workshops to actually talk with patients, with clinicians about it, which has been hugely helpful. And we intend to do more in the autumn, and there will also be a survey that will be sent out to all those who've participated in the workshops so that we can get some additional data about it. So watch this space for this information. It's the kind of project we don't want to rush because it's really, really important that we get everybody in the community engaged and really get something workable that works for all our different stakeholders across the community. Okay, we're going to be starting the clinical aspects slightly early, so I'm going to ask Mumita to come up and take over, which will mean that we'll have a bit longer for Neil's talk as well, which I think is hugely helpful for the kidney doctors here. And I think I'd just like to make a very important thank you to the adult nephrologists who are here at IPNA, because I think one of the things that's very exciting about Allport is that when we originally looked across the whole community, it was quite siloed with a syndrome across adults, children, geneticists. It's really quite hard to get information from one community to another. But I think the fact that we have people like Mumita and Neil, and we have Rosa online, who are all adult nephrologists, it's hugely exciting. The fact that we've got the geneticists all happy to be engaged and involved in this as well. And now increasingly, thanks to the wonderful work of ASF getting the hearing research progressing, it's really helping us connect up the different groups. So, Mamita, thank you for coming. It's lovely to have a local Canadian too to present, to talk to us and facilitate. I'll hand over to you to do the next session.
Okay, great. So I'm going to briefly reintroduce Professor Neil Turner, who's a professor of nephrology at the University of Edinburgh and is an adult kidney doctor, as we just heard, at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh in the UK. And he's going to update us on the latest clinical guidelines.
Thank you very much, Mumita. And it's really lovely to be here at IPNA, a pediatric meeting. But actually, people who've been to these workshops before will know that meeting across all the usual boundaries is one of the strengths of what we do. And we had a fantastic dip into science this morning, a deeper dip into audiology, some deeper than we've gone before, which is impressive given that we've only got a day. And it's also really lovely to be here in person, and I almost made a comment about some of the discussions at lunchtime around naming. So many different things come into that. I completely agree with Susie about pausing and thinking a lot before what we think would be best. There's so many different pressures. Compared to that, treatment is a bit simpler. But it does have to be highlights today, given the time we have. And if you read the guidelines we have, well, first of all, you'd have to read all the CKD guidelines, and they're about 200 pages. And then there's at least 2 and possibly 3 sets of Allport guidelines, which have progressed year by year, but actually need to progress on again. So here we are. We've turned the church upside down, and we're looking for its kidneys, I think. I hope we're going to walk past that later tonight. So this is what I'm going to try to cover. Available drugs that definitely slow Allport, and there's one of those. Available drugs that probably slow Allport, and I've only got one of those as well. Existing drugs that might slow Allport, well, there are about 40, but the odds are a bit better for 1 and maybe 2, and I'll just hint at those. What I won't be talking about very much is the future approaches that might slow Allport. I think those are down to be covered later on in the day, and it's a long topic. We've heard some kind of warm-ups for that earlier in the talks about the science of how to reduce the effects on the cells that are causing the trouble in Allport, or possibly even manipulate the gene abnormalities which are responsible. It's really exciting. Then something really mundane. What blood pressure target should we be aiming for? Should we just do the same as everyone else, CKD, or is there anything different? And what about this very broad spectrum of Allport? At what point do we need to introduce the treatments we're talking about? So it's very important that I start by saying that most of what I say is going to be about severe, classic, if you like, Allport. So the kind of severe Allport that causes kidney failure in deafness and kidneys going off in your teens and renal failure in your 20s and maybe 30s. Those timescales are moving longer, which is good news, of course. So first of all, something that we've known for a very long time, if 1994 is a very long time. Actually, there was evidence about low blood pressures being valuable in kidney disease before that, but it was the modification of diet in renal disease study, which was presented at the American Society of Nephrology in 1993, published the next year. It was a huge study, and this is actually really important to a lot of people here. The findings about making dramatic alterations to the amount of protein in your diet were pretty negative. In these patients who were well looked after and had reasonable blood pressure for the era, what diet you had, that was low protein diets, didn't seem to make much difference. And the targets that they used for blood pressure in this study were not particularly aggressive by modern standards. So it was 140/90 versus 130/80. But what they did find, and this slide is showing some Macintosh Mac confusion, what they did find was that the more proteinuria you have, the faster your kidney deteriorate in CKD. These were kidney patients with a whole range of diagnoses, important to say. The more proteinuria you had, the quicker your kidneys deteriorated. But the more protein you had in your urine, the more benefit you got from the lower blood pressure target, down to 130/80. Now, at the same meeting of the American Society of Nephrology, a really important additional discovery was made or presented. And this was by Ed Lewis, and it was using captopril, the very first ACE inhibitor, in patients with diabetic nephropathy. So another kidney disease in which you get a lot of proteinuria. Now, the blood pressures were the same in the two groups, but one of the groups had captopril as the first drug they used for low blood pressure. And as you can see here, the people on captopril versus the people who weren't on captopril showed much slower worsening of their kidney disease. Now, since that point, there have been numerous studies in all kinds of different diseases with proteinuria which show that this appears to be a general rule. It doesn't seem to matter what causes your proteinuria. If you're on an ACE inhibitor, it slows down your rate of progression. It doesn't mean that we can ignore blood pressure. And the other important thing about it is that some of these studies used angiotensin receptor blockers, which work on the same pathway as ACE inhibitors, and they seem to be just as good. But most nephrologists still try ACE inhibitors first, just because of the weight of evidence behind them. Now, around 10 years later, when these were well in place, Oliver Gross published some really interesting observations. It's worth saying that this was also interesting because we've been looking at some of the animal models that we heard about this morning and giving them ACE inhibitors. And in animals with Alport mutations, ACE inhibitors slowed down Alport syndrome too. This was a big surprise because we kind of thought it's a genetic condition and we aren't altering the genetics. But it seemed to be behaving just like other kidney disease with protein, with high levels of protein. And you'll see that since clinicians started using ACE inhibitors for Alport syndrome, the age at which people have been reaching end-stage kidney disease has gradually been progressing. And Oliver's data also suggested that this is from European registries, the earlier you start your ACE inhibitors, the more delay you got to progression. We can maybe go later on to how early can you start. We don't have a definitive answer, but we think they seem to be safe down to quite a young age. Now, so ACE inhibitors really started being used about 25 years ago, and until 2020, there wasn't another leap forward. It was ACE inhibitors and blood pressure control was the most that we could do. But in 2020, the DAPA-CKD study was presented at the European Society of Cardiology. Now, cardiology. These drugs are anti-diabetic agents. They make you pee sugar. Nephrologists thought it was a stupid idea, actually, to treat diabetes with that. But the FDA and the regulatory agencies force companies that are introducing new drugs like this to look not just at one narrow system, like this was mostly for heart failure, but they want you to, or diabetes initially, sorry, they want you to look at all of the outcomes, mortality and so on. And all of the studies on this class of drugs, the gliflozins, the flozins, were showing quite remarkable benefits for patients with diabetes who had heart failure. They were having less heart failure. They were having less kidney disease. And this wasn't it was so much of an improvement that it couldn't be accounted for by the relatively small improvement in their diabetes. So the DAPA-CKD study actually deliberately included about a third of the people in it did not have diabetes, but they were given this anti-diabetic drug. And the justification was that because it seemed also to work in patients with heart failure who didn't have diabetes. And the differences between outcome were really dramatic when you consider that these patients all had good blood pressure control already, and they were all taking ACE inhibitors effectively. So this was being added on to their other therapy. So this is what happened to patients with CKD to which this drug was added in. And there's a 40% difference essentially, between the rate at which patients were reaching end-stage kidney disease. Now, this was a big group of patients with mixed diagnoses, and there would be very few patients in there with Allport, but probably there were some. For IgA nephropathy, it's been published that there has definitely been a reduction in the rate of progression. It's not possible for other conditions, because the numbers get smaller, to be so certain, but it's not yet certain that it works just as well for every condition, but it does seem to work very broadly. The other amazing thing is that even the side effect profile was really very good in patients treated with this new class of drugs. The complications which had been reported in diabetics given these drugs did not seem to be occurring in non-diabetics. Plus, patients got less acute kidney injury, less high potassium, less low sodium, better magnesium levels. It was almost too good to be true, to be honest. And if this hadn't recurred in multiple studies in which there were patients with degrees of kidney disease, you probably wouldn't believe it. But this was absolutely in line with the previous evidence that there was. And the other thing just to say from this study, although they didn't enroll patients with a GFR of less than 25, they did continue treatment down to much lower GFRs, and they still didn't see any increase in side effects. And in fact, when they looked at all the different groups of patients, so with diabetes, without diabetes, with higher proteinuria, with lower proteinuria, with higher GFR, with lower GFR, they really couldn't see any group that didn't benefit. There was a missing group here, and it was patients with very low levels of proteinuria and worse kidney disease, and there's a subsequent study, EMPA-Kidney, using a similar drug, which is going to answer that quite soon, we hope. So what do we think about them in Alport syndrome? Well, we know they reduce proteinuria. There's actually been several things published, including at the ASN last year, but I just chose one that came up last week from Beijing, so they seem to work right around the world. And because of these remarkable effects and the fact that they aren't the most expensive drugs, amazingly, their availability is widening, and very widely across the world now. They've been accepted into guidance for treating CKD. So chronic kidney disease of any etiology that looks high risk of progression in most countries now gets you onto the list of people who can have these meds. There are differences, and here just a couple of days ago, apparently that's now the case in Brazil as well. There are a couple of questions which are particularly important when you've got a condition that affects young adults. And one is, how young can you start? When we discussed this last year at this meeting online and other places, the evidence and the license probably will limit what you can do in some countries, but where clinicians have the ability to prescribe these medicines, the tendency seems to be to think fully grown patients are probably good, and whether or not there's an age limit does depend on where you are. And certainly we have been starting young patients with Alports who are fully grown on the full dose of dapagliflozin. And the other really important question is that these drugs are not known to be safe for pregnancy, and there's one or two reasons to think that they'd be a bad idea. So absolutely not safe to get pregnant on these drugs. That is different from ACE inhibitors, where in some countries, again, it's okay to prescribe ACE inhibitors to high-risk patients as long as the patient is capable of and aware that they must stop their ACE inhibitor as soon as pregnancy is confirmed. Different story here. So are more agents better than one? Well, we can now say that for SGLT2 inhibitors, the general opinion, but it's not yet proven, and we do want to watch what happens over the next few years, yes, you can add SGLT2 inhibitors to ACE inhibitors. We've answered another question in the last few years, which is, what about adding in an angiotensin receptor blocker and an ACE inhibitor, which reduces proteinuria and all the things we see, lower proteinuria seems to be better. No, that is not a safe course of action. It causes high potassiums and a risk of acute kidney injury, and in older patients, it's actually associated with a more rapid progression to end-stage kidney disease, perhaps as a consequence of repeated acute kidney injury. So that's not a good thing. The next drug on the block is going to be an aldosterone antagonist. Now, spironolactone is the family of drugs, and it's quite difficult to use that in patients with kidney disease because, just like ACE inhibitors, it tends to cause high potassiums. So a number of us have played around with it because it does reduce proteinuria, but it's been difficult. There are some new agents coming along that are non-steroidal aldosterone antagonists, and eplerenone is an example of that, that seem to be less prone to causing high potassiums, and there are some very encouraging results in diabetics. It's interesting that the drugs that are benefiting heart failure have a huge overlap with the drugs that are benefiting kidneys this way, because aldosterone antagonists are good in heart failure as well. And although we did wonder about it for years, vitamin D has now been shown not to make much difference. But endothelin blockers have been back and forth a bit. They do have some issues, but they're probably the next one down the line for a really good study in CKD. They don't cause hyperkalemia. They do have some fluid retaining effects, which could be important in patients with advancing kidney disease. And just coming around, so blood pressure targets are coming down from what we saw in the MDRD study. KDIGO now recommends a target blood pressure of 120, not 130, not 140. And NICE in the UK is a little bit more conservative. For patients with proteinuria, it's saying 130. And these recommendations are broadly coming down around the world, mainly based on the so-called SPRINT study, which showed that lower and lower is good. And it's just worth pointing out that all of the interventional studies on blood pressure that have been carried out have shown that lower blood pressure targets are better. None of them yet has shown a target that's dangerous. Now, of course, if you're falling over and not tolerating a medicine, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not good for you in any way. But for your kidneys, it's good to run lower blood pressures. There's also a lot of fuss about how you should measure blood pressure, because in the SPRINT study, like most research studies, it was done in a very standardized way, putting someone into a dark room for 10 minutes and having an automatic machine do it. That's not very practical. And I don't know about other people's clinical practice, but I think that the getting patients to measure what their blood pressure is like at home is really powerful, not only because it tells you what's going on when they're not seeing you, but because it really helps the patient to understand and engage with why they're taking their tablets. And seeing as we're now looking at several tablets for people who are healthy and well, it's really, we cannot do this without having the patient on side and understand what's going on. So I put in a bit more detail than original, but I got to the prescription for high-risk Allport. So ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers at the maximum tolerated dose. Most nephrologists are now reckoning that the downside of the SGLT2 inhibitors is so small that even if we can't prove that it's good for Alport yet, we should be giving it. And it's really easy. It's a single dose, 1 tablet a day, very little in the way of side effects. It does reduce blood pressure a little, so patients who are struggling with their ACE inhibitor dose may need to cut that back. Is that the right balance? I don't know. That's guessing. You need blood pressures that are certainly excellent for your age, remembering that young people need a blood pressure below the median for their age, which may be below 120 if you're young. Diet should be normal protein, not very high. You should restrict salt. There's lots of evidence for that in kidney disease. But it's really important that it's healthy, wide-ranging, and that you live actively. My goodness, we've heard some fantastic examples of that from Sam and others today. And I've put Colin Bagent's picture at the bottom right there. Colin is a transplanted patient with Alport syndrome, but he led the study which showed that statins are good for patients with CKD stage 3 and above, and he's also centrally involved in the study of empagliflozin in kidney disease, which will tell us a bit more about low GFRs and lower levels of proteinuria. Yeah, and the other measures should really be as for CKD. Now, we've also heard quite a lot today about the wide spectrum of abnormalities, including no kidney abnormalities at all in people with Allport mutations. So what about these patients? And this is a discussion really between you and your physician. It's going to be influenced by your family history and the mutation, sure, but it's also going to be influenced by your age, your GFR, the amount of any proteinuria, and any trend in any of these things. The thresholds for starting flozins in the UK are really at quite low levels of proteinuria, and well, some will think that's fine, and some may hesitate a bit. And I've mentioned the issues about those drugs in pregnancy. Really interesting time, because we've now got more drugs than we ever had before, and they're broad CKD drugs, but we're just moving into the era of having specific anti-Alport drugs that I hope we'll be hearing more about later today and maybe at other meetings. I mentioned it's wonderful to be here in person. The Edinburgh Festival happened in person this year, so this is a hello from some of our clinical team from the Edinburgh Festival. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for that wonderful talk. It's an exciting time to be talking about therapies in Alport syndrome. So perhaps we can open it up to questions from the audience first, of which there are several. So I'll let Neil, you stand here so you can answer the question.
Thank you. Wonderful talk and great overview over at least 2 decades, I would say. From all of these compounds, are there any of them having any effect on hearing loss? I think the data are quite limited, obviously, but why is that? Yeah. So are there any regulatory reasons? Are there no suitable endpoints? Or are we simply following up the wrong mechanisms as nephrologists?
The truth is nobody's looked. It's very depressing, isn't it? I think as a community, we're very, very much convinced that we ought to be doing this certainly in any studies specifically into Alport syndrome.
I think it's very disappointing.
Yeah,
so at least as an
exploratory
endpoint and could be put into any study.
Yeah, we haven't been in a position, we're going to talk about registries and so on later, we haven't been in a position to do very many really powered studies with enough patients in to be able to see differences so far. But that's absolutely where we want to go. And when we are looking for drugs that are targeting Alport syndrome in particular, we must seek to do that kind of analysis.
So from the list of compounds or compound classes you have presented, where would be your biggest hopes in at least delaying progression of hearing loss?
I don't know. And we're really just at the beginning of understanding what might be going wrong with hearing. It was so fantastic to hear an extended discussion of that this morning.
Thanks for. I'm so sorry. Thanks for an amazing talk. It's awesome as a patient to watch the progression of stuff like flozins from kind of an idea when we were doing workshops a few years ago now to almost established clinical practice. I wonder how you're applying the findings of low blood pressure and information about protein intake and their ability to extend the life of existing kidneys to transplanted patients. Is there anything in this presentation for transplanted patients to look up and be interested in?
So when you get a kidney transplant, the Alport kidneys, which caused the original trouble, are no longer doing anything. So actually you're talking about a kidney that doesn't have Alport. So it's like for any other transplant patient. There's a lot of information to suggest that having good blood pressure control is much better for you as a transplant patient. You should also be even young people should probably also be on a statin. And this is because a lifetime of chronic kidney disease and high blood pressure, it's a stress on the cardiovascular system. Beyond that, this is a subject that is getting a lot of research. How do we, make now that kidney transplants are doing so much better, the question of what about the rest of the health of the patient is coming right to the fore, and that can only be good news.
Yeah, thanks for indulging me.
So I'm so glad that you spoke about Flozins. I'm wondering at what point, what are you telling patients, and what should we be encouraging patients to talk to their nephrologists about?
Yeah.
When do you prescribe them? Is there a certain level of proteinuria? Of your creatinine's a certain level? What are those considerations, and when should patients be talking to their doctor about it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to make that important disclaimer that there is international variation on what is permitted or possible financially, but where it is possible, you are probably wanting to postpone kidney failure for as long as possible, and all the evidence suggests that earlier treatment is better. So our practice in patients who look highly likely to reach end-stage kidney disease in their lifetime, now if they're 60, that, maybe 20 or 30 years, but if you're 20, that's, 70 or 80 years. So the criteria logically ought to be a bit more liberal in young patients where it looks highly likely that things will progress. And that's the way we've been interpreting it. So if patients have, when they come into the adult sector, which is the kind of time when you can think about prescribing these drugs, which is 16 in Scotland, 18 in some countries, 25 in others, that's definitely when you should first start asking that question. And if they have a genetic mutation, which looks very bad, or a family history which looks like early end-stage kidney disease is likely, and anyone with CKD and lots of proteinuria, actually, at that age, or even medium amounts of proteinuria at that age, is highly, at very high risk. So we've been introducing these drugs pretty liberally. That's our own experience. We see exactly what I just showed you in the data from China. GFR appears to drop a bit when you start them. Blood pressure, some patients notice it, particularly the ones who are struggling to tolerate full-dose ACE inhibitor, but most don't. And proteinuria drops. So we'll see where we are in 20 years.
I have a question about SGLT2 inhibitors.
Yeah.
Are they going to increase the risk of infection? And if so, those Alport patients with a lot of cysts in their kidneys, should they be avoiding taking it?
It looks as if in non-diabetics, any increased risk of infection is small. We did worry that would be a big thing. And there are some, in diabetics, you can get some serious genital infections, really life-threatening. But this has not been much encountered in patients without diabetes. Is there anything? Well, I do get anxious about patients with lots of urine infections. And I think there is a small increase in some studies. So if an individual patient is having a lot of trouble that seems to have been worsened by the thing, then you're going to have to weigh that up and probably knock it off.
Yeah. Can I ask another clinical aspect? Because I think some of our patients has hypothyroidism due to urinary loss of thyroid hormones. Is that anything you have experienced? Do you treat it?
I'm not aware that that's a problem in CKD patients in general, and I don't think it would be any worse for Allport patients. We base treatment for low thyroid levels not on the levels of thyroid hormone, but on the levels of the TSH, which responds to low thyroid levels. So I don't think we'll be underdiagnosing it, but I could be wrong.
But I think
interestingly, there are some very interesting effects of thyroid hormone on GFR, so separate question.
Okay. But in nephrotic syndrome, you might have this loss of thyroid hormones.
We know that patients with proteinuria are at risk of losing some things. One of the important ones is vitamin D, and yes, there are various protein-bound things which are lost that way. Yeah.
That's an area to look into.
Yeah, it is. It's not come up as a consistent problem in most patients. Yeah. You're getting your steps in today, Laura.
I just wanted to comment about the drugs that may affect hearing.
Yeah, good.
There was a paper that Dominic Cosgrove published back in 2016, I think, that showed some of the changes in the Alport mouse hearing in relation to stress. And then in that same paper, he also showed that the treatment of the Alport mice with endothelin receptor blockers was able to ameliorate some of that. So those are currently being evaluated.
It was
at least in children, for patients with Alport.
Yeah, it was so good today, wasn't it, to hear that the experimental models we now seem to be testing hearing, so it will be possible to test those ideas out. I did mention the endothelin receptor antagonist as potentially quite an interesting development. They do have some issues, though, but yeah, obviously that would probably sway the...
I just wanted to also add a comment about the hearing, since it's actually my job to develop drug. Basically, the answer is actually both FDA and EMA really likes to encourage people to look in the hearing when you go for a drug for the kidney. However, the challenge is that as it is, doing a trial in Alport is not easy, and you basically select people who have the renal inclusion-exclusion criteria or the hearing. If you want to do both, it becomes more challenging to even do the recruitment. But that, and most of the people who are doing the development are, including myself, we are nephrologists, we are looking into the kidney. But that's really the practical aspect that I'm sharing with you. But definitely it's on everybody's mind when they are planning for developed drug to look for it if they can. To see if
I would just add to, sorry if I can chip in, to add to Ali's comment there on the hearing. I think we should definitely continue to recommend that audiology is included, and of clinical trials that we're recruiting into in the UK in children and young people, then audiology is included, even if we're not we're monitoring it. I think there's an opportunity that we shouldn't miss to monitor, even if that isn't formally built into endpoints.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really important. We may be helped by the fact that there's the possibility that there may be a bit of use of drugs that could have adverse hearing effects as a side effect, and that'll really get us used to doing those measurements.
Okay, so great discussion in the in-person audience, and similarly, there's a lot of questions online too. There are two questions from Fang Wang. I'm wondering if Fang can ask the questions, like if we can, if Fang is able to ask the question.
Can we get Fang up on the screen? That's Rachel.
Well, if Fang is not able to be on the screen, I can ask the two questions. So for the first question is, for adult Alport patients with proteinuria and normal blood pressure, such as 90/60, can RAS-I or SGLT2 inhibitor be used?
Yes.
as tolerated by the patient, as the individual, as
cautiously.
You said. Yes.
I mean, I'm sure that those who look after young patients will be pretty used to having to give ACE inhibitors to people with blood pressures of 90, and they often can only tolerate a bit.
Yes.
But I would still try to give them it. Yeah.
And second question is, proteinuria was controlled well in Allport patients with RAS inhibitor, whereas hyperkalemia often was detected. How to balance the effectiveness and adverse effect?
Yeah, high potassiums usually only become a problem when you've lost some glomerular filtration, when you've lost some kidney function. So it's not usually a problem in the early stages of Allport. Interestingly, we may see less of that if we're using SGLT2 inhibitors as well. The evidence suggests that it is a bit protective. But there does come a point where I'm very shy about trying to limit people's diet at that stage unless they've got huge intake of potassium, because potassium is in fruit and vegetables and healthy things. So unless people have got really strange dietary habits, 2 pints of coconut water or something every day, then I would probably reduce the drug that was causing the trouble.
There's a question from Janine Reed. If you could comment on bardoxolone, please.
Do I have to? Yeah. Actually, for those who don't know, bardoxolone is a drug which there was a lot of interest in Allports. There was some anxiety in the Allport medical and science community that the evidence behind it working was based on numbers, not real hard outcomes, and that there wasn't. Earlier today we heard some wonderful science about using experimental models, mice and maybe one day maybe a dog, to be cured, but in order to test out whether these drugs not only do short-term things that look good, but whether they really extend the kidney life of the animals. There wasn't much of that evidence of bardoxolone, and there's some concern that the numbers were being altered as a sort of illusion without real benefit. The FDA had that opinion, and it has not been licensed, even though it did appear to show in some Allport patients improvement in numbers. I think this is it's a real lesson for people trying to develop drugs for rare diseases. There was a real push to try and get this drug through with perhaps less evidence than everyone felt comfortable with, and I'm sure we've all learned from it.
There's a question from Konstantinos Deltas. For a patient with a severe mutation, what is the longest time span on medication without reaching kidney failure? He doesn't specify the medication, though, so I'm not sure if it's ACE inhibitor or SGLT2 inhibitor.
Well,
it's probably
no one
ACE
can be
inhibitor.
no one can be on SGLT2 inhibitors for long enough for that to be known.
Yeah.
I think that's a really difficult question to answer because there are some patients with what appears to be a severe mutation who don't have the severity in their family even, let alone in the individual, that the mutation might suggest. Now, sometimes these maybe the body is reading through what appears to be a stop codon partially, or maybe there's some sort of alternative splicing of the molecule that corrects some of these frameshift mutations or splicing mutations. We don't fully understand. Interestingly, we're very interested to try and exploit that kind of the body making a mistake to reduce the effect of mutations. It does appear that in some patients it's being ameliorated. I guess if you wanted to ask that question, you might say, well, when you've got a whole gene deletion and there's no possibility of funny alterations of splicing and so on, what's the longest? And I don't know. We do know that people with that kind of mutation do tend to have earlier onset disease, and we heard again this morning that they also tend to have earlier onset hearing trouble. but otherwise they're similar, and there's actually quite a lot of variation within the families.
A comment, I think, from Rachel Lennon. Audiology is incorporated into trials in children and young people with Alport syndrome, and we should continue to recommend incorporation of audiology.
Yeah.
Judy Savage said, great talk, thanks. And 2 comments from Matt Hall. Great summary, Neil. Until we know more about the actual versus potential risks of SGLT2 inhibitor in pregnancy, should women of childbearing potential with Alport avoid Flozins?
Well, they should certainly use good contraception. Yeah, it does have the potential to, a bit like ACE inhibitors. You can think. I don't think there's any animal evidence that it's dangerous, but that's not enough. We've learned that before with drugs in pregnancy. We know more about ACE inhibitors because they've been around for so long that, despite all advice, quite a few people have got pregnant on them. Even though early on they were certainly recommended not to. I'm certainly, and I'm sure colleagues are as well, just saying you must not get pregnant on these.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, the second comment from Matt Hall is the same. So,
yeah.
So that are all the questions in the online chat. Is there any other remaining questions before we conclude this session? No? So with that, we'll thank Neil. Thank you so much. And we'll, am I supposed to invite?
Right. Thank you very much, Neil. Fantastic summary there. And we are now going to have a slight change in terms of the content, in that we're going to go back and hear more about the patient activities within the countries. So one of the things that I spoke about this morning is that we are in the early stages of setting up this really exciting alliance, the Allport Syndrome Alliance, which is where we as a community are all working together as patients, as clinicians, as laboratory scientists, as pharmaceutical companies. But there is some really important day-to-day work that happens within the countries. And this is led by the national patient organisations, and some of them are very long established. And certainly when we set up Allport UK in the UK about 10 years ago, we had lots to learn from. And we're actually going to start with Italy. And I invite Rosella to come, and we're literally going to have a quick canter around the world in terms of some of the updates. So Rosella, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Elia's mother. Elia is an Alport patient. He's here with us. He's in the media team. And I'm a volunteer of the Italian Association of Alport Syndrome. ASAL was founded in 2011 with the aim of connecting and supporting Alport patients and also their family. Oops. Oh. No, something got wrong. Oh my God, this is not my.
Don't worry.
This. Okay. Okay, I got it. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, with the support of our scientific committee, we carry out our mission. That is to say that we share information through meetings, conferences, and conventional and non-conventional channels. We also contribute to the research by raising funds and publishing calls for research. We strongly believe in cooperation with all stakeholders of Alport syndrome, and we support the constitution of Alport Alliance, as Susie just said before. Well, coming to the activities of ASAL, we are particularly involved in the psychological aspects. And we have two main proposals for our community. That is to say, we have a listening desk. That is, it's a face-to-face meeting with psychologists. So one patient or a familiar of the patient with the psychologist. And we have also what we call Never Alone Again, a listening groups with several patients that are together with the psychologist. And we really had a very positive response for these both two projects, and we are going to repeat them. We have also very new project that involves both the psychological and the educational aspect, that is to say, what we call our heroes. We have 4 Alport teens that are writing a story, a very funny story, with the help of a psychologist, and they are describing their daily life with Alport by turning the difficulties of this pathology into superpowers. So please keep connect, because I think this will be a very amazing story and will be ready soon. So as for research, in 2022, we allocated €50,000 for 2 important research. We are in the board of director of the that is realizing the Italian register of Alport patient, and we are also involved with a network of Italian clinicians and specialists to set up a multidisciplinary protocol that could connect the nephrologist, the psychologist, the otorino, the ophthalmology, I don't know, okay. And finally, we organize also meetings in schools of different grades in order to raise the awareness on Alport syndrome. Okay, just say grazie, not only by my part, but also by all the Italian community. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move swiftly on to Nigeria. So I'm hoping Emmanuel Uduari is online for us. Very sadly, Emmanuel was supposed to be here in person, but had visa issues, but is actually going to hopefully be joining tomorrow. So some of you might have a chance to meet there. Emmanuel, are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Excellent. Over to you, Emmanuel, to tell us about Nigeria.
Right. Okay. Good to be with you online. Tomorrow, like you heard, I will be in person. By way of introduction, I want to start with a geographical context. A famous American president once called West Africa a country, and some others still think Africa is a country. So I will just give a little geographical context or historical background. Nigeria is a country on its own, comprising 20 million people with 923,000 square kilometers and 371 ethnic groups. Juxtaposing, it's about 1/3 the size of Canada, with about 7 times its population. And that's a huge population density. The teaching hospital where I work is in Benin City, in capital of Edo State, one of the 36 states in Nigeria. It's located in South geopolitical zone. It has a population of over 1 million people. Now, by way of chronicles, the diagnosis of called for 85 gene mutation Alport syndrome was made in February, just over 2 years ago, in a family comprising a single mother and her 2 male sons at University of Benin Teaching Hospital, where I was working at the time. The boys, her older children, are now aged 17 and 15 years. Important to mention this background because Alport syndrome, up until this point, had never been reported in a child in Nigeria. So it was way out of the blues to have a case that was not just reported, but confirmed. It was confirmed in the elder child via molecular genetic testing at Synlab Laboratory. I think it's reputed to be the largest molecular diagnostic laboratory in Europe. The report was published in the case report of nephrology and dialysis journal of the European Society of Pediatric Nephrology just about a year ago. If you Google Alport Syndrome Africa, you can access the report. It's open source. It's both in public and PubMed and also on ResearchGate. It just chronicles the work that was done in making this diagnosis. It's the first reported case in a child in Nigeria. It's the first genetic diagnosis of Alport syndrome in West Africa, as one of the first cases in recent history in Africa. And paradoxically, it's instructive to note that Alport itself, etymologically, was derived, as we know, from Cecil Alport, who reported the first case in South Africa just some decades back. So it's quite instructive that we're still in the embryonic phase in as far as the evolution of understanding of this disease and bringing clinicians and policymakers together in its management as far as Africa is concerned. Right now, where we are is we've created an Alport Syndrome Foundation. Just before I came back to the UK, I was in Nigeria to help ensure this happened, interacting and interfacing with different structure of government in Nigeria to help establish this and affiliate to the Alport Syndrome Alliance. And at this point, I must be very thankful to Alport UK, Susigia, and Alport Syndrome Alliance for the wonderful work they did with this introductory letter to ensure that that's smoothing the process of establishing this foundation. The aim is to provide a nexus between patients, carers, clinicians, and of course the international community. It's one of the first such national organizations in Africa. So what we're doing is to build a network across Africa by first liaising with clinicians in Ghana, which is the West African sub-region, and then South Africa. We're going to talk with nephrologists like Dr. Elliot Tano, a nephrologist in Ghana, and then Dr. Busiwe, a nephrologist in South Africa. And we're creating a integral platform for engaging. We are at the primordial stage in Africa, but what we want to do in a resource challenge setting is to ensure that we create templates that will enable us, first of all, easily make or foster diagnosis of these patients, because firstly, we don't have many persons who know about Alport syndrome, and what you don't know does not exist, even amongst clinicians. I remember discussing a case with some clinicians, they're like, what is Alport syndrome? We've heard about that in medical school, but does it really exist in Africa? So that pervasive ignorance still exists, even amongst the scientists and clinical community. And we need to address that first, and then begin to interface with government. In my trip to Nigeria, I was able to interface with the federal and state governments, really high-level discussions to ensure that we can begin to evolve policies that ensure that we can capture those patients and that we can properly manage them, as well as liaise with the international community in providing care for them. We have some particular issues in Africa. The health needs in Africa and Nigeria in particular are peculiar. Quite unlike the Western world, I think the only parallel may be the United States of America, but quite unlike the Western world, most the preponderant payment in Africa is out-of-pocket payment, and that's grossly limiting. My wife and I spent over $5,000 just to make that genetic diagnosis and continuously fund dialysis for the child. The elder child right now has had about 60 dialysis sessions this year alone. Just entered end-stage renal disease in February, had about 60 dialysis sessions, and there's no week my wife and I don't have to contribute to ensure that he has dialysis at least twice weekly. That would be strange to many Europeans and North Americans, apart from maybe Americans. But even Americans have access to health insurance coverage. That's only 1% in Nigeria. So that's a real challenge to ensure that, well, we create a foundation, not just to do what other foundations do, like create a nexus between clinicians and carers, but our foundation also has to go the extra mile to actually raise funds to fund continuous testing and management of these patients, because we don't have health insurance coverage in Africa. So as long as we have out-of-pocket payment, it means foundations like Alport Syndrome and Reckoning Disease Foundation in Nigeria, which is what it's called, will have to become charitable organizations to help fund the dialysis of these patients and ultimately renal transplant. And that's the trajectory we are on currently. It's a great challenge indeed, but I'm a church minister, and my parents are church ministers, so I inherited incredible optimism from them. So our resolve to overcome is greater, and by God we will. And I will end on the notes like Martin Luther King would say, we will just sing like the old Negro spiritual, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Thank you for listening. God bless you.
Emmanuel, thank you very, very much. And we have Francis Flinter, who spotted the article that Emmanuel and colleagues from Nigeria published and got us in touch with them. We're going to move back to the UK, so I'm going to invite Aura Zeeley-Smith to come up and tell you about some of the things we do in the UK.
Thanks, Susie. Oh, it's a bit high. My name's Aura, and I am an Allport syndrome patient and a medical student. Well, in a couple of weeks, I will be anyway. And I'm just going to talk a little bit today about the UK activities available to support children, young people, and families living with Allport syndrome. So my journey started with Allport UK 3 years ago. I was 16 and it was a year after my diagnosis. This was the 2019 International Workshop on Allport Syndrome held in Siena. I'm going to be completely honest, I really did not want to go. Sorry, Susie. I hadn't met anyone with Allport Syndrome at that stage, and I was just a little bit in denial about my diagnosis, and I had a bit of fear of accepting who I really was. So there was a lot of persuasion and influence from my mum, who did, in the end, convince me to go. And I am so pleased that she did. The community that I've met since then, it's just completely opened my eyes. So the rest is pretty much history. Here I am today. I think I need to go to the next slide. Great. So in the 3 years that I've been with Allport UK, I've been astounded by the support and the community that's really been built by Susie and the team. So the first thing really is the Allport Warriors Facebook group. It creates an online community so people from all around the world or all around the country can just have a conversation. Perfect for the mums, who always have plenty of questions, plenty of different stories that they want to discuss. For the youngsters like myself, we have the Allport Avengers group. We're 18 to 25-year-olds, and we mainly just have a chat. Not necessarily Allport related. There's a lot of things we chat about, from people's birthdays. I think the other week there was something about gaming, and various different things like that. So moving on, as we saw this morning from Sam and Joseph's video, there's so much more to us than our diagnosis. So we all have our own hobbies and passions and what we want to do with our lives. I, for one, I'm very into my music and my dance. Joseph had his cycling, as we saw in the video. I know, Sam, you're particularly interested in cycling as well, as your filmmaking, of course. Ilya, I spoke to earlier, he said he loves football and playing the guitar. Patrick, I know, is a very good journalist, and I know you like your gaming. Denny, apparently, you love going to the gym all the time, apparently. Apparently that's his thing. And as we met yesterday, the Peterson family, they have a lovely basketball court in the garden, and that's their thing. So everybody has their own thing, and we're all so passionate about that. That's just, the Allport is just a little part of us. Moving on to my next bit. I'm so grateful for our Allport legends. Neil's one of them, as we've just seen. Rachel, who had a lecture earlier, and Francis, who I know has been moderating, and so many more who are always on hand to explain things to us, answer any of our questions, no matter how small or big the questions are. They're always there to help us. Finally, moving on to my last slide, I just wanted to put this up. And I want everybody to look at the photo. Just the sense of community that's created by Allport UK and now across the entire world with the Allport Alliance, and obviously all of us here today. And I just wanted to spread the joy with these photos. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I think I'm passing over to Lisa.
Let me begin by saying I never in my life have I wanted to have an English accent more than I do right now.
I think they're pulling up the slides now. I'm an Alport patient, X-linked female patient with a son, X-linked as well, of course, who is now 8 months post-transplant. And I'm really honored to be the executive director of Alport Syndrome Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization in the United States that is led by and dedicated to Alport patients and their families. And in fact, it was established in 2007, and the person who's responsible for co-founding the organization is in our audience, Sharon Lagas, and I'm so grateful to her because, yes. I know when I was diagnosed, and I Googled Alport Syndrome and finally helped my family figure this out, the first thing I did was get in touch with Alport Syndrome Foundation, and Sharon picked up the phone and treated me like family. And in the role that I have now, that's what we try to do as well, me and my 2 colleagues. Let me make sure that I'm doing this right. That way? Yes. All right. So ASF's connection to the patient community. We have about 9,700 members that are patients, family members, clinicians, researchers, and industry contacts. All of our membership, our events, our programs and services are free of charge, and that's through the contributions of lovely donors and families and friends. And the sort of things we have are, for example, on our website, tip sheets for if you're just going to your first pediatric nephrologist visit. What are the questions you should be asking of your pediatric nephrologist? We just came out with a family planning guide that gives you all sorts of information about the genetics and maybe what you could ask or expect of a genetic counseling visit, things to consider for pregnancy and planning pregnancy. So all sorts of tip sheets and free guides. We have a coloring book that we developed last year to help families with young children talk about living with Alport syndrome, to begin that education really early, diet guides, that sort of thing. We have members from 80 different countries. We're primarily United States, but there are, of course, lots of folks in the world who don't live in a country that has a patient organization, so some of them find us online and join us. We have a 3,700 person closed Facebook support group of patients and families. Joy Toll has been incredible for a long time, helping establish that and continue to moderate. She's the friend and resource for so many families. Alportsyndrome.org, our website, has 134,276 visitors in 2021 and auto-translates into 20 languages. Our YouTube views from the website in 2021 were almost 18,000. And I have to say, one point of information about this kind of thing that really strikes me is that the time, in local time, of the time when somebody, we have a timestamp, but when somebody looks to us and actually joins for our registration online to become a free member, and the typical time, the most average time, is between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. in their local time, which to me tells us that these patients are Googling us in the middle of the night and they're anxiety-ridden about their disease. And that's why I'm so grateful that we have this organization that Sharon helped establish. ASF Community is a mobile app that's free of charge. It's available only to patients and families. And again, that has all the resources, a lot of them that are on our website, so you can have it in your pocket when you're at your doctor's office with questions. All the questions that come into us at info@alportsyndrome.org are answered within 48 hours. Because all 3 of us on staff are patients and the 7 board members, everybody's affected by Alport syndrome. So we take that very seriously. And when patients get in touch with us, we respond because we are patients too. ASF's scientific and clinical resources. We have our new NKF patient network, Alport Syndrome, which is a patient registry we established in the US, launched March 2022. Neptune, we just launched this Alport Syndrome Natural History Study with 39 states in the US and 1 in Canada. And we are really grateful to Dr. Rowe for being a principal investigator, and also her fellow medical advisory committee member, Dr. Fornoni, who are the co-principal investigators for that natural history study, which just launched this year. It's a 3-year study, including 63 patients, so we can get these valuable biosamples. We have a 15-member medical advisory committee of clinicians from around the country, a scientific advisory research network that works as a consortium under the umbrella of ASF, and these are researchers, leading Alport experts, and some of them you've heard from them today. The Voice of the Patient report we have online, which was from the patient-led focused drug development meeting with the FDA from 2018. On our website, we also have lots of published articles on Alport syndrome archived on our website from all over the world, so that we're hoping that, when researchers are Googling, they can find a real wealth of resources right there. And we build relationships and try to keep these relationships up with the FDA, the NIDDK, KDIGO, all those letters that we're all familiar with, and lots of rare disease organizations as well, where we find lots of commonality to advocate as patients with rare disease, and relationships that we've built with genetic testing companies. So we have both, we're very patient-focused, but we also realize we must engage on the science side, and we do our very best to engage positively with pharmaceutical companies and drug development, because we realize how important that is. That's our end goal. We want new therapies, and we're looking for a cure, and that's part of our role as ASF, to help educate the patient community about the science side of things. So thank you so much for your time.
And I think we're going to head to Germany now, and I'm hoping Christoph is online. Thank you, Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Christoph. I think we just need to get your presentation launched. It's happening now. Go ahead.
Oh, great. So as mentioned, I'm representing the German patient group called Alport Syndrome group, who am actually a father of a 19-year-old son who was diagnosed with Alport in the age of 4. And I'm also a board member of the German patient group. The next slide, actually, you can see where we are. We are representing not only Germany, but if you can move to the next slide. We are also representing families in Austria and also Switzerland. And our patient group was founded around 25 by family members of affected children, doctors, and people related to the Alport syndrome. And currently we have approximately 230 member families, and also, of course, our medical advisors. We move to the next slide. So our goals and activities include, of course, to increase and spread knowledge on the Alport syndrome and the related symptoms to allow early diagnosis and the treatment of affected children. Instead, actually, we want to raise awareness in the society on the Alport syndrome as a rare disease. We act, that's a lot of our activities, we act as a point of contact for families faced with symptoms pointing to Alport syndrome or diagnosis. We also act as a forum for experience exchange between Alport patients and their families. And also we want to reach out to increase awareness on pediatricians, urologists, or other physicians of Alport syndrome and related symptoms, diagnosis, disease progression, and therapies. And also we are monitoring together with our scientific advisors, and we share the progress on non-clinical, clinical research and development, as well as the learnings from existing treatments on Alport syndrome with patients and their families. You can move to the next slide. So we're actually lucky that at the end of last year, November, we had actually our first in-person meeting since the start of the pandemic. It was so good actually to meet and talk with the people. We have, of course, other conversations are possible there than the virtual meetings. And we are beside kind of official agenda points which are required for organization. We always looking forward for our scientific discussion and a scientific agenda. We had Professor Oliver Kroos, who actually gave an overview on diagnosis and therapies for Alport syndrome, overview on ongoing clinical trials, result from early Protect Alport study, and the impact on treatment recommendations in Germany and globally, and also the importance of early diagnosis and activities to raise awareness on Alport, and also an overview on ongoing planned research activities in his own working group. And we are also happy to get insights on the genetics of Alport syndrome from Professor Julia Höfele from the Technical University in Munich, who actually presented us the genetic backgrounds on the X chromosomal variants, autosomal variants, and D-genetic variants, and also gave us an overview on the human genetic studies on Alport at the TU Munich. And it's actually really important to have these exchange also with the scientific advisor that is in that all the families and the members actually can get in touch with also the scientists there. So that actually I can hand over back to the next person.
Have we got our final person online? No. Okay, we're going to move on into. Does anybody have any questions? I don't know whether Aura, Rosella, and Lisa would like to come up here. Yep, we're just the microphones here. Do Rosella and Lisa want to come up?
If he's still with us, I had a question for Emmanuel in Nigeria.
Emmanuel, are you still there?
Yes, I am here.
Excellent. We have a question for you from the room. Joy Toll is just going to ask it. Here we go.
I was curious because you were talking about funding dialysis for the patients that you discovered. Do you guys have access to things like ACE inhibitors and ARBs to treat your patients before they reach end-stage renal disease?
That's a very good question. Yeah, the structure of payment is a challenge, but the science is basically the same. ACE inhibitors have been around in Nigeria and Africa, I think, since I was a medical student or way before then. So, and they're pretty cheap in Nigeria. They're pretty cheap. I think the challenge is getting to make the diagnosis and then treatment thereafter. Unfortunately, for my patients, and that's why your question is very instructive, it was 5 years after the initial presentation of symptoms that diagnosis was made. They've been managed for ocular and ophthalmological symptoms. I'm a family physician, a general practitioner by training, so I was able, I think, fortuitously to create a syndromic picture, and that's when we started the ACE inhibitors. But after about 8 months, they had a rebound effect, and this is where we are. As a result of that, to answer your question more strictly, what we have done, collection template-wise now, is that any person who's an ophthalmologist who sees a child with an ocular problem now in my hospital back home in Nigeria, you test their urinalysis, do a urine dip for them. The same thing with the ear, nose, and throat surgeons, so that we can catch them early enough and commence them on ACE inhibitors.
Excellent. Emmanuel, thank you very much. I also see we've now got on the screen, we've got an additional moderator with us. I'd like to introduce Dr. Marina Aksanova from Russia. And I have to say, Marina has been fantastic because despite the political shenanigans that are going on in other parts of the world, we've agreed that it's really important for us to work together to support patients despite all the things that are happening. So, Marina, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I think you were going to ask some questions of the patients. Do you have a question? Oh, we need you're muted at the moment. No. Can't hear. Okay. Marina, I will leave you to sort out the audio. I'm not quite sure why we're not hearing you at the moment. Meanwhile, can I ask Rosella and Lisa to answer a question? So we've got clinicians here today. What would your advice be when they first diagnosed a patient? What would your advice be in terms of supporting those patients?
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to use the words of my son because he's a big advocate for this, is he felt so alone in his diagnosis for far too long. And he's met a lot of other young patients who were told, oh, you'll probably never meet another Alport patient in your life. It's so rare. And he said, it's isolating alone and enough just to get the diagnosis, but then to be told that. So instead, to encourage them to seek out your country's patient organization, and if it doesn't have one, join another country's patient organization, because connecting with other patients at any age is, they're like cousins and family, extended family right away. You feel so much less alone. There's so much, I think we all underestimate, patients and clinicians, the power of patients connecting together and sharing their journey and their experiences. I know for me that was really powerful. For my son, it changed his entire world. The first time he met other young people with Alport syndrome, it shifted his perspective for the rest of his life. It shifted how he sees himself, how he sees the world, and I think that made all the difference. So that would be my first piece of advice. Please encourage your patients to get in touch with the patient organization for connection and support.
Excellent. I think that that's really good advice. Thank you. Rosella.
Yeah, I do not have anything more to add because I totally agree with you, Lisa. And I just want to say that a very important thing is that
Marina, we can hear you. We've just got somebody talking in the room, so if we can hear you, hold on 2 minutes and we can hear your question.
10 seconds. And the doctors, I mean, the specialists, should connect each other. I mean, you could not go to the nephrologist and then to the how do you say? Okay, audiologist.
Eye specialist.
And, yeah, I'm sorry. And they have closed door one to the other. Okay, we have to connect them. This is really very important also for the patient when they are so little. And every time they have to speak again, okay, I'm Elia, I have this and this and this. It's really very sad for the patients and also for the family.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Rosella. So have we, Marina, can we go to your question now for the patients?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you beautifully, Marina. Well done.
Thank you. I would like to ask, regarding your experience, what is one piece of advice you can give to country that is setting up new patient organization?
Excellent. Okay, so for a country starting up a new patient organization, who wants to answer that one? Joy?
I can say, because I started the Facebook presence for the American Foundation, Alport Syndrome Foundation, just start the page, and then the patients will find it, and you'll find that you have a community much quicker than you expected. And as long as you're providing good medical information and connection with the local doctors through somebody who moderates the group, you'll find that people come for the support, they come for the answers to questions, and they build a community around that.
Fantastic. I think that's very good advice. And I know we connect extensively with our colleagues in China, where we have a very well-established patient group now, where the numbers are huge. I think there are about 3,000 or 4,000 people, and they're all on WeChat, which is their equivalent of social media. And it has been fantastic for the young people. They have different groups on WeChat, etc. too. So social media is a really important part. Aura, I'm going to put you on the spot. So if somebody was wanting to start a patient group, what would you advise from a patient perspective, as a young person? What would be helpful to you? Say, so Marina's in Russia. How should the Russians start a patient group?
Okay, put me on the spot. The first thing that I would definitely say is putting patients at the heart of it. Ultimately, it's for them. You've kind of got to put yourself in their shoes. What would they want? So I think the best way of doing that is asking patients, really, what do you want? That's pretty much it.
I think that's a good answer. Thank you. I think when it's really tricky to know where to start with patient organisations. And the thing that I found in my business career, when you're working internationally, every country is different. So I don't think you can come up with a cookie cutter approach. It would be lovely to be able to do that. But I think you're right, Aura, because there is a cultural difference for each community. And I think that's why it's important that although we're trying to set up this alliance and be stronger together, there is also a lot of things that need to be done locally and specific, because also the health systems in all our countries are very different, and the communication with the clinicians, etc. So actually having patients that you can connect with in your country is hugely inspiring to do that. So one of the things that Allport UK we use as a fundamental model as we think about what we do is are they familiar with the 6 pillars of well-being? No, it's a standard psychological construct about what creates well-being in people. And one of the things that Lisa was talking about, the social connection, is one of the key ones. Because if people can connect socially around their condition, it reduces the level of anxiety, and it's a known thing. Some of the other ones are also activity and sleep. There are some kind of obvious ones around it. The other thing is, one of the other elements of it is also helping others. So don't underestimate the opportunity to get people involved in helping others. I think it's a vital role that we all as patients can do. And indeed, it also helps people when the clinicians get involved or the researchers, actually seeing that other people care about your rare disease is huge. So having, I know a lot of us have scientific advisors. It is gold dust having those scientific advisors who turn up at our patient days informally and just talk to patients. And they really feel empowered. They can answer questions as well. So actually seeing the contributions that clinicians can make is absolutely huge. And don't underestimate that. It's really, really powerful. Okay, I think we have another question.
Well, I was handed the microphone. I really don't have much to add, but really the simplest thing is just starting with a few patients, some of your most passionate, caring patients, and bringing them together. And it'll grow from there. Persistence pays off, and collaboration across, the clinical community, the patient community will just grow. So if you build it, they will come. And
Excellent.
Persistence will pay off.
Very, very wise words, Sharon. Thank you. And as it has shown in the States, very much so. Marina, thank you very much for joining us. And I know you've been involving, we had a number of Russian patients who actually registered for this workshop. And I do hope that we can work with you and try and help you set up a patient organization in Russia. And we thank you for all the work that you're doing, particularly for developing the registry in the Children's Hospital. It's really important work, and we're really grateful to you for looking after those families. Thank you. And thank you also to Emmanuel, who will be here tomorrow. We're going to hear a bit later from Emmanuel as well. And Christoph, thank you too for joining us from Germany, to Lisa, to Rosella, to Aura. I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. Excellent. Okay, time to move on. Thank you very much. It is time for a break. Time for a cup of tea. So we need to get back in about 20 minutes, I think.